The banshee smiled, exposing a set of jagged rotten teeth, and cooed out loud at the response, this one from those wide-eyed imbeciles inside. Her smile grew impossibly wide now, across her whole face, literally from ear to ear, a gaping razor slash of a smile splitting her face in half. Her life was short, her purpose clear. Inside, Larry took a faltering step back as the witch outside opened its maw, exposing a darkness in it even deeper and more terrible than the void it had emerged from. He stepped back and his heel inadvertently slipped in the very blood he had spat at Peroni only moments before. His leg shot from underneath him, sending him sprawling to the floor in a heap. It saved his life. The banshee had only one purpose, and that purpose was death. The banshee screamed. A split second later, the window and the banshee itself exploded simultaneously from the sheer force of the blast. The banshee to dust, the window, frame and all, into the room like a hurricane of deadly shattered glass and splintered wood. Peroni was directly in the path of the murderous debris as it flew into the room in the blink of an eye. She didn't even have time to scream before it ripped mercilessly into her. Nichols turned away in horror as it did. He was hit himself, caught on the very edge of the icy blast that followed the witch's scream, which filled the room like a shriek straight from hell itself. Tiny fragments of glass and wood stung his face, but little else. The wounds they inflicted wouldn't even leave a scar in a day or so, unlike Peroni. With a scream of his own, Larry rolled around on the floor and began to shout and swear. Little flecks of blood appeared through his grimy shirt where he had been grazed by shrapnel. But it was Peroni alone who had taken the full brunt of the damage. The priest had to force himself to look back at her, and it made him sick to his stomach with shock and guilt. Peroni had fallen to her knees now with her head bowed as if in prayer, her hands clasped over her ruined face in a vain attempt to stem the flow of blood that was flooding through her fingers. Her choking, muffled screams barely audible to Nichols above the ringing in his own ears from the explosion of sound the witch had unleashed. Then, as he watched on, unable to drag himself up to help her, she fell forwards, hitting her lacerated head hard on the floor, making her scream all the more. The pitiful sight finally shook Nichols into action. He got to his feet, but before he could move to help her, Larry scrambled back to his feet, blood streaming from his nose, and stood unsteadily in between Nichols and the prone woman. "Gimme the box!" Larry screamed, blood spitting out of his mouth with the words. "God, man," Nichols implored. "It's too late for that now. Let me help her. For pity's sake." He came at McCulloch but with no real energy and tried desperately to push him aside so he could get to Peroni, but Larry sidestepped him and then with surprising speed, pistol whipped Nichols hard across the face, sending him crashing to the floor with fireworks exploding in front of his eyes as he went. Somehow he managed to keep a tight grip on the box as he did so, like a rugby player going down from a heavy tackle but refusing to give up possession of the ball. McCulloch aimed down at Nichols, determined to put an end to his pathetic life once and for all. He was about to squeeze the trigger when he caught a flash of light out of the corner of his eye and for a brief moment half expected it to be followed by a clap of thunder. But there was no storm brewing outside, far from it. He chanced to look out of the hole in the wall, where the window had been. The void out there, which up until this point had been nothing more than a pitiless black, now seemed to Larry to be lighter somehow, a dark gray. As he looked on, a crack of searing bright light snaked across the gloom, flashing like folk lightning before being swallowed up by the darkness again. Larry, what he was seeing. He could see glimpses of the street outside, shadowy outlines of houses, trees along the road disappearing off in the murk, but there nevertheless. "It's failing," he said breathlessly, hardly daring to trust his tired eyes, but it was true. He could now make out things more clearly. The tree-lined street outside flashed briefly into view, clear as day for a split second before it faded from sight. "Jesus, it's failing." Larry took a breath, then drew his attention back to the priest, who was now, quite fittingly, on his knees. He waved the pistol at Nichols. This was the real power here, this was the glory. Faith had never stopped a bullet, not in Larry McCulloch's world. He shook it so the gun parts jangled together, but the priest was oblivious to the threat, lost as he was in the carnage of the room before him. Lost in the suffering of his fallen comrades, those fools who has followed him so blindly. And where had it gotten them? Larry almost pitied Nichols as he took in the horror around him. Almost. The priest was weeping now, huge great sobs racked his body like a child. Because he was the cause of all this. Not Larry, who, as usual, had barely a scratch beyond the superficial. Nichols was to blame, and he knew it. It was written all over his tear-stained face. "God forgive me," Nichols sobbed, still clinging to his misplaced faith. "Maybe he will," Larry told him and aimed at his forehead. You can ask him yourself face to face soon enough. It was a good line to end things on, Larry mused. But Nichols barely heard him. He was lost now to overwhelming despair. In that wretched moment, he would have gladly welcomed a bullet, to end it all. Anything was preferable to the soul-crushing survivor guilt this suburban slaughterhouse would bring. A quick, painless end to it all. It took all his remaining will not to look up at his would-be executioner and begged him to do it. But Nichols couldn't tear his tortured gaze from Lewis and Peroni, twins as they were in misery and certain death. Twins he had fathered with this whole sorry affair. Better a bullet than to endure another moment of this. Enough was enough. Larry squeezed the trigger and braced himself for the weapon to kick, spew fire and death, not to mention the mess it would make of the priest's head. The hammer came down with a dull click. Fuck it. Larry cursed, hell of a time for a misfire. He pulled back the slide which ejected the dud round, sending it spinning cinematically over his shoulder, and then brought the slide back again, chambering a fresh bullet into the breech. A shaft of bright orange sunlight broke through the rapidly fading void and warmed the side of Larry's face, raising a smile as it did so. It hit him like a spotlight on the lead actor standing center stage having just delivered a masterful soliloquy. The off-stage cue for the grand finale. Boom. Close curtain and fade up rapturous applause. Take the plaudits and then off to the after-show party. The smile on his face gave way to an almost maniacal grin. After all the shit he had been through in the last couple of weeks. And somehow it had all turned into another fine chapter in the life of lucky Larry McCulloch. Full of drama and tension, but one where our hero came through in the end, blooded but not bowed. Larry felt nothing short of blessed as he prepared to pull the trigger again. Jez, Larry, an American said from behind him. I wish you'd decide whose side you're on. Each word felt like a bullet in Larry's back and knocked the wind right out of him. Despite the brightening sun on his face, a chill ran through him. He gasped, his mouth suddenly dry. It was now that Nichols finally looked up at him. He looked almost disappointed Larry hadn't been able to finish him off. Yes, he looked many things, but surprised wasn't one of them. What have you done? Larry asked, his voice tinged with accusation, but heavier still with fear. He turned slowly and sure enough Randall was standing in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, taking in the room with a look of mild amusement on his face. Throwing caution to the wind, Larry swiftly aimed at the Yank's chest and pulled the trigger. The hammer came down, but again he was treated not to a deafening roar but a mute click as the gun failed to fire once more. Impossible. He quickly went through the motions again, pulling back the slide, dud round spinning off until it rattled off across the floor, then slide it back, chambering a new round. Click. Fuck. Larry took a step towards Randall and repeated the action. Click. His head swam. Again, click, impossible, another step, click. Impossible. He could almost hear the gods laughing at him, laughter that was fading moment by moment as they deserted him. Click, click, click. Finally he stopped the pointless display and looked down at the weapon in his hands as though it had purposely betrayed him. It's a neat trick, huh? Randall said, nodding to the useless pistol. A wry smile crossed his features. Wish I'd known it a few decades ago. Ooh, I like it in here now, Ishrel whispered, peeping around Randall and into the blood-splattered room. Ishrel was feeling braver by the moment, Randall noted, but not so brave yet not to make sure Randall was between him and the poem. Quite the bloodbath. The one called Lewis was staring blankly at the Italian woman, his breath shallow, his half-close eyes twin pools of grief. What was her name? Pretty, in a stern way he recalled, but that was before she had felt the banshee's breath, and all that came with it, on her face. She was still screaming, her mess of a face and her blood-drenched hands curled up in a ball. Lewis' breath, such as it was, started to come out in short sharp bursts, shallower with each one. They would both soon be dead. That reminded him. He looked past the disbelieving McCulloch to the priest who was dragging himself to his feet. He had all the appearance of a beaten man, but Randall knew never to take a priest at face value, and especially once with a miner's poem tucked under his arm. His gaze met the collector's. Randall, he implored. Please. Randall gave him the slightest nod in recognition, then screwed his eyes tight shut, weary as he was. This would take some effort to pull off. He reached into his pocket to activate the charm he had previously prepared hidden there. The room went black. Larry, still grasping the useless pistol in his hand, cursed under his breath and waited for the floor to open up and send him plummeting straight to hell, if that's how things like this worked. But a mere heartbeat later the room reappeared around him, only brighter, the void outside now completely gone. He had to squint against the daylight flooding in. He almost patted himself down to make sure he was still in one piece. He was still intact. Lewis and Peroni, however, were gone. Nichols stumbled forwards close to Larry. No, wait. Randall, what have you done with them? His voice was high with panic. Relax, Randall said, holding up his hands as if to show he had nothing up his sleeves. You'll see them soon enough. Was that a threat or a promise? A deal's a deal, Randall added. What? Larry almost choked on the word. He made a half-hearted grab for Nichols' arm, but the priest pulled away, his gaze dropping to his feet. What deal? A deal's a deal. Words to be damned by. Larry suddenly remembered the text Nichols had sent as he grabbed the phone from him. What deal? He repeated weakly, jabbing an accusing finger at the priest. Nichols, he said firmer. What's he talking about? Larry, Nichols said faintly. He hung his head, unable to stand the accusation, the fear in McCulloch's eyes. Then after a full 10 seconds of contemplation he looked up with bloodshot eyes. Believe me or not, he continued hoarsely. I really am sorry it's come to this. He gestured down to the gun still in Larry's hand. Even after you did what you did. Which I suppose I can't really blame you for. He met Larry's eyes a little firmer now. You are what you are, he stated, then he looked away again, deflated. It's such a mess, such a bloody mess. He clearly wanted to say more but could find the words. You set me up, Larry said in naked disbelief. I had no choice. Nichols turned away and placed the box, which seemed to have gained 1,000 pounds in weight, on the table. But, Jesus Christ, you're a priest, Larry stuttered. You swore to protect me. To the death, you said. You were all supposed to die to protect me. There's still time for that, Nichols replied bitterly, and turning he rested his backside against the table to avoid falling over altogether. There's still time, he said again and glanced at the pool of blood where Peroni had been. No, Larry told him. No. I'm sorry, Nichols said and ran his hand over the bejeweled box on the table by his side. He couldn't think of anything else to say. Quite the Shakespearean scene of betrayal, Randall thought, watching the two of them go at it. He was feeling more energized by the minute now the void was gone, and seeing Larry's dismay buoyed his spirits no end. Oh, shit, Larry said as if the realization of his situation had just hit him. He spun to face Randall and let the pistol drop to the floor. Oh, shit. Look, Randall, wait a second. You're shit out of luck, Larry, he told him, and finally stepped into the room. The presence of the box still weighed heavy on him, its power was no less potent for his approaching possession of it. He forced himself to move closer even though it made him sick to the stomach. Randall, please. Listen to me, Larry pleaded, his voice cracked as he spoke. Come on now, Larry. Calm down, you've had a good run. No, Larry snapped at him, his pale face reddening. This is bullshit. This is bullshit. No, he insisted as if it would make any difference. Then he turned on Nichols. You sold me out. Fucking Judas. Judas. It was as good a description as any, Nichols had to admit, and impressively biblical coming from McCulloch. He concentrated his attention on the congealing blood on the carpet and couldn't imagine it were possible to feel any worse about himself, or about this whole godforsaken situation. Larry was easy to hate, even easier to betray as it turned out after what he'd done to Lewis, but still his heart felt like it was being ripped out of his chest. The only meager consolation was that Lewis and Peroni were out of this, and that from what he knew of Randall, the collector would kill him also. He just prayed, selfish as it was, that he did it before Larry, so he wouldn't have to witness the fruits of his treachery. Israel poked his head around the door and wrinkled his stubby nose, then caught sight of the box. There, he exclaimed, pointing to it, and then skipped into the room with surprising grace. Must be the tutu, Randall thought as he watched the demon pirouette through the human slaughterhouse. Very balletic. Israel danced around McCulloch, who suddenly dropped to his knees as if he could sense the creature and began sobbing into his hands. Israel sniffed the air around him as he passed, taking in the sweet aroma of grief, then with a hideous grin spun off to where Nichols was supporting himself against the table. The freakish ballerina, although still clearly weary of the box, put his skinned monkey face up close to the priest's and tried in vain to lick his nose. Oof, Randall shuddered. Just be glad you can't see what I can right now, Father. But Nichols was lost somewhere close to madness and didn't hear him. Kill the fucking priest. Israel screamed into Nichols' face. Kill him and all the others. What are you doing letting those other two stuck pigs go? No survivors. No survivors. My companion wants me to kill you, Father. Would that be bad form? This caused a flash of something close to amusement on Nichols' face, and his mind came back from wherever it had been teetering. I suppose you could, he said softly to the blood-stained floor. After all, you do hold all the cards now. Don't you? His voice was full of fatigue but still held a hint of defiance.